Hi, my name's Justin, and this is the San Joaquin Delta, a beautiful body of water that I call home. I have been fishing the Delta since I was 6 years old, and when I heard that my home was in trouble, I had to take a drive to find out the facts about what's going on in my home.
Are the salinity levels rising in the San Joaquin Delta? And if so, how will the salinity levels affect the water we drink?
Yeah, so we are seeing increased salinity throughout the Delta. A lot of that is due to impacts that we're seeing from climate change. So our main freshwater source in the Delta comes from the mountains, so snow melt, essentially. As we're seeing less snowpack every single year, we're getting less precipitation, we're getting longer periods of drought. Essentially, we're seeing less and less of that freshwater flow coming into the Delta. And what that freshwater flow does is as it flows in, it pushes back the salt water coming up from the ocean in the San Francisco Bay. And so with less fresh water, we have what's called salinity intrusion, which is when that salt water is coming higher and higher and higher into the Delta. What's interesting about that is that it's highly, highly managed and monitored. So there are laws and rules in place that essentially say certain levels of salinity can't go beyond a certain point in the Delta. And so that's called the X2 line. So it's literally the letter X and the number 2. And that line has to stay 80 kilometers or like less distance from the Golden Gate Bridge. So it can't exceed 80 kilometers from the Golden Gate Bridge up into the Delta. So when you ask, is it increasing? It's like a yes and no. So it's increasing in the sense of we're seeing more natural salinity intrusion, but because it's so highly monitored, like you won't necessarily see it here every day because it's so highly controlled. And so with that X2 line, what it means is anything up in the Delta past those 80 kilometers has to stay below 2 parts per thousand salinity. And so that's still being monitored. The way that they help keep that number is by using all of the reservoirs that we have. So we have reservoirs all throughout the Delta holding and storing fresh water. And when we notice, and by we, I mean Department of Water Resources and the California Water Board and things like that, when they see an increase in salinity moving up in the Delta, they release fresh water from those reservoirs to flush it back. And so this is getting more and more challenging as those reservoirs are often having less water in reserve to push it back. And so the impacts of salinity intrusion on the Delta it varies. So it depends on who you talk to. So for community members, local community members whose daily water source relies on the Delta, with salinity intrusion, what that means is more treatment of salt water into fresh drinking water, which is really technically challenging and really, really expensive. And so there are options, and a lot of places are looking into creating desalination plants, which will take salt water and turn it into fresh water. But again, super expensive process, really, really complicated. And so in theory, with more salinity intrusion, we have less drinking water for communities. And then with agriculture, you also can't grow plants with salt water, right? The salt will kill the plants. And so they rely heavily on this super fresh water. And so there can be potential future impacts for like crop yield and soil health and all of that stuff with salinity intrusion. And the last part of that that's really interesting is if you look at historic data, salinity intrusion is part of the natural ecological flow of the Delta. So if you look at maps dating back, early 1900s, late 1800s, stuff like that, the salt water would actually come way up into the northern and eastern Delta, and it's just part of the yearly flow. And what that salt water can do is bring new nutrients, it can bring new animals into the Delta, add to the food chain, add to the health of the Delta. So it's this natural flow, but we've changed that flow because we need that fresh water. So it's this constant balance of what's good for the ecosystem historically and ecologically, and then what do communities and humans need for production. So salinity intrusion is one of the biggest challenges, and it's only getting harder with climate change happening.
Next question. How does rising sea levels affect the agricultural business that surrounds the San Joaquin Delta?
Yeah, rising sea levels, also another big challenge with climate change. Rising sea levels will also increase that saltwater intrusion. As sea levels will rise, it will again start to bring in more saltwater into the Delta, which will impact agricultural ability and agricultural production. Other issues with sea level rise happening are increased risk of flooding and through these major weather events. And so the Delta is composed of over 1,100 miles of levees, right? And so these levees are built up using riprap, so using soil and dirt and rocks and sand and all types of stuff, right? And what these levees do is keep the water back on one side, almost like a dam, where they can then pump out the water on the land to grow agriculture. So there's about 55 human-made islands in the Delta currently that are being used for agricultural development. And basically, with that increased sea level rise, it can potentially create more damage to these levees. And so repairing levees is really expensive, and it's very time consuming, and it's pretty much a year-round effort. They're always being chipped away at by natural causes. So sea level rise will increase the cost of maintaining those levees. And then when levees break, huge impact for flooding potential.
Oh, wow.
Especially, there's a really big concern about with earthquakes happening. So there's models saying that if an earthquake happens, say upstream in the Delta, a levee breaks. It'll essentially cause a cascading domino effect all the way down the Delta. So one levee break starts to flood. That flood water will break the next levee, will break the next levee, will break the next levee, and you just have the potential for just like catastrophic floods that will flood not only farmland and stop production, but also flood communities out here.
Wow, so that would flood the entire delta almost.
Yeah, it would be intense. So that's a big concern, especially being in the area that we are, which is prone to earthquakes.
Wow.
Yeah.
How serious is the threat to the delta smelt, and what would their species recovery look like?
Yeah, Delta smelt has had a tough battle. So Delta smelt are endemic to the area, which means they only really live here in the Delta. And the reason that they're really important is that they're a bioindicator. So they are an animal that will tell us essentially the health of the Delta and the health of the ecosystem.
Oh, wow.
Because they're so sensitive. So if there are plenty of Delta smelt around, it tells us, great, our water quality is good, the habitat is good, they're getting resources and nutrients to live, the food chain is active. But when we don't see Delta smelt, it tells us that something's off. Maybe water quality isn't good enough, maybe temperatures are rising, maybe salinity intrusion. And so Delta smelt are having a really tough time. Every year, Fish and Wildlife does a Delta smelt survey throughout the entire Delta. And we really haven't found any since like 2017.
Wow, 2017.
Yeah, so every year they come out with a report. And from my understanding, every year since 2017, there hasn't been enough statistical evidence to suggest that there is a healthy Delta smelt population. So they're almost entirely gone from the Delta, which again tells us how the Delta is doing. And these fish are a really important part of the food system and the ecosystem. And so it's a really hard battle for them, and we're not seeing them. And like I mentioned earlier, even our slough here that was built for Delta smelt, and I've never seen any, and I've never heard of anyone seeing any. And so there are restoration efforts happening. Some ways that could look like is trying some way to increase water quality out here. And that's really challenging because there are so many stakeholders involved. So that could be updating regulations on like farm production and farm runoff, because agriculture does have an impact in water quality when you have chemicals and pesticides being used for growing food, and then it rains and it runs off into the water. So that could be something happening. Even just habitat loss is one of the biggest ones. So with all of these human-made islands, it has destroyed the natural habitat for the smelt. So they are not able to live in this kind of cold, brackish, turbid area that they're used to. And so habitat restoration, recreating some of the historical wetland ecosystem would be really helpful. And there are also places that are working on kind of like breeding Delta smelt for release. So places like UC Davis, they have a Delta smelt lab. And for years and years and years, what they do is they have some Delta smelt, they work on, they breed them, they build up the population, and then they release them into the Delta with hopes that they'll be able to survive and continue to repopulate. The issue is, from what I've heard, is that they're fine in the lab setting where it's very controlled, right? Everything is good. Water quality is good. Habitat is good. No external challenges. And then once they get released into the Delta, they just can't survive. The conditions out here just aren't good enough for them right now. And so people have said, like, Delta smelt are so sensitive, if you even look at one wrong, they'll die. So there are a lot of these efforts, but I think it'll take a lot of different leverage points. So yeah, changes in agricultural practice, changes in habitat restoration, and then working with places like UC Davis that are trying to bring back populations.
Next question. How will the export of freshwater to Southern California affect the local sportsman culture that is synonymous with the San Joaquin Delta?
Yeah, from people who engage in sports and recreation out here, the challenge with exporting water is that we just don't have enough, right? So we don't have enough water to begin with in the Delta because of things like these mega droughts that we've experienced, back in 2015 to 2018, 2019. And we're just not getting enough of that fresh water that these fish need. And then, so if we don't have enough, kind of like a baseline of fresh water, and then we're taking even more out of a system to move it somewhere else, we're just putting these fish into like a disadvantageous position, right? There's just not the water and resources that they need. So as we continue to export water out to Southern California and the Central Valley, again, we're removing this really critical resource of fresh water, of healthy, clean, fresh water that these fish need to survive, which again lowers population and then will impact the ability to fish and recreate like that. There's also other issues, like I mentioned, of just lack of habitat available. So as we continue to build human-made islands and have development out here, we remove that critical habitat that's needed for these fish to thrive. And then there's also issues of invasive species. Fish like bass are historically non-native and invasive, and a lot of time for fishing, those are brought in because they're great sport fish, right? We love them, they're fun to catch, they taste good. But these non-native fish and other non-native species in the water will essentially outcompete native fish. And so they'll outcompete them for resources, for space, they'll eat them. And so you have this constant battle between native species and non-native species, and often non-native species kind of just thrive. And so we're seeing lower and lower native fish population and overall population because of this imbalance that's happened of bringing in non-native and invasive species that again impact the ability to recreate out here. So, I've heard stories of, way back in the day, you'd look down and just see salmon, coho salmon on their migration. All you see is just thousands and thousands of salmon, and now we rarely see them. You see all types of aquatic life just anywhere you go. And now it's getting harder and harder to find them. And it really does have an impact on people who are fishing, people who are recreating in that way. It's not the same. The fish aren't getting as big. The economic impact as well, right? There used to be a ton of tournaments out here, fishing tournaments. Like this was a hot spot for fishing tournaments, which brings in a lot of great economic boom to the area. And those aren't happening quite as much either.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it's been really tough for people who love the Delta for that recreation and that fishing.
Next question. Do you have any concerns about the federal government taking more control over California's water management?
Things I've heard from either side is, just like everything, there's pros and cons. I think that there could be some benefits from a little bit more federal oversight. There could be more standardization of rules and regulations, and potentially these standardizations across the Delta might be able to provide the kind of boost and support that it needs to recover and become what it has been historically. So yeah, having a larger oversight creates a more kind of even playing field for the Delta to be able to thrive. I think there could also be some additional funding in there that could be really good. Funding is always one of the largest, if not the largest challenge for any sort of ecosystem restoration, ecosystem management, anything like that. So having federal funding could be really, really helpful. But then on the flip side, there is a lot of power in local decision making, right? Federal government may have thoughts and ideas, but they're not here, right? They're not here.
They're not the locals.
They're not the locals. They're not here in the Delta. They don't necessarily, and this is general kind of broad strokes, but like they don't generally or might not have the same connection, historical understanding, relationship to the land. And so when you are able to provide power to communities who live here, who have lived here for 5, 6, 7 generations, right? Who have seen this place change, who have seen it grow, who know the land and the water intimately, there's a lot of power in that knowledge. And with that local knowledge, you can, again, make those decisions that are, in theory, or potentially best for the place, right? Like, that's who you want to make decisions, the people that know it best. So with federal oversight, they could make decisions that they think might be good or are based on models or based on whatever, but aren't actually here on the ground, feeling the impacts, seeing what's going on, knowing the land. So there's a little bit of that distrust of are the decisions that are being made really what's best for the local community members, and are those local community member voices being heard?
Great responses, Mr. Moore, and I want to thank you for your time, your service, and overall your resources. It really has been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Well, I found the answers to my questions. I must say I'm disappointed with my findings. I wonder how bad the Delta will become until people finally realize that there is a problem. Hopefully by then, it's not too late for the San Joaquin Delta. I'm Justin Mora, and this was my movie.